Russia is starting joint military drills with its neighbor Belarus today. NATO says it is Moscow's largest deployment to the former Soviet country since the Cold War. The exercises come as tensions build over what some Western countries fear are Russian plans to invade Ukraine. Diplomacy is continuing, but the U.S. has criticized the new joint military drills as escalatory. Kiev says these are about psychological pressure. Russia claims the forces will return to their bases when the drills finish in 10 days' time. The U.S. is also deploying more troops to Eastern Europe as a show of solidarity.
They're bolstering NATO's borders. On Wednesday, U.S. troops arrived in southeastern Poland. The United States has also begun moving its forces from Germany to Romania. Around 1,000 NATO troops are expected to follow in the coming days. Denmark has also announced that it's enhancing its military preparedness, deploying fighter jets to the Baltic Sea. But many Western analysts do not see NATO's actions in response to the more than 100,000 Russian troops amassed near Ukraine's borders as a direct defense of Ukraine.
Now, in terms of numbers, this is meant to be a symbolic show of resolve that the NATO is united and it will defend its members if attacked. For Ukraine, we've provided arms and training, but we're not providing any direct forces. Nobody is.
Further consignments of British weapons have arrived in Ukraine. Britain has said it only intends them to be used in self-defense. Speaking in Berlin on Wednesday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said a dual approach was needed, adding that while all diplomatic channels must be pursued, allies must be prepared to act if Russian forces cross these borders and into Ukraine.
For more perspective on the story, we can speak now to Carl Bildt. He is the co-chair of the European Council of Foreign Relations and former Prime Minister of Sweden. Mr. Bildt, welcome to DW. I want to start with Russia's military drills. Russia says these drills are for its own security. Ukraine says this is psychological pressure. Do you think that these drills are a further escalation of the situation?
They are clearly one part of the very major military buildup that we've seen from the Russian side during the last few months, and it is still ongoing. Apart from these maneuvers in Belarus, we have a significant concentration of Russian forces along the borders of Ukraine. And it's the largest such buildup of military forces that we've seen in Europe for decades. We have to go way back into the Cold War to say anything like it.
I want to ask you now about NATO's response to all of this. We saw the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg speaking at a news conference a short while ago. Let's play, first of all, what he said and then talk about it. Let's listen in.
This is a dangerous moment for European security. The number of Russian forces is going up. The warning time for a possible attack is going down. NATO is not a threat to Russia, but we must be prepared for the worst, while remaining strongly committed to finding a political solution.
Mr. Bildt, we heard Jens Stoltenberg say this is preparing for the worst from the perspective of NATO. And you wrote recently on Twitter, it is a good sign that Germany, for example, is upping its contribution to the NATO battalion in Lithuania because this is a reassurance in uncertain times. But still, these NATO forces pale in comparison to what Russia has been preparing. So does this really act as a deterrent to Russia?
I think the main deterrent is, as a matter of fact, the preparations that are done for very significant sanctions by the EU and by the US in case there's another Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those sanctions have been, and that's still the ongoing process, coordinated between Washington and Brussels, and then coordinated between Brussels and the different member states. And the way I understand it, they would be very significant and have a very significant effect on the Russian economy. And hopefully that will serve as a deterrent so that there is no further incursions and invasions of Ukraine. But we don't know.
But there has been some disagreement among Western allies of what those sanctions should be. Do you think that Europe's reliance on Russian gas is serving as a liability at this point?
I think it's clearly a problem. And I think there is an awareness all over Europe, I think even in Germany, that long term there would be sort of a need to reduce that reliance on Russian gas because it provides Russia with leverage in political situations like this, then replacement of that can't happen overnight. But I think over years, absolutely. I think there needs to be a redirection of energy dependence.
I want to ask you about the West putting its hopes on the long-stuck Minsk agreement that was first negotiated in 2014 and 2015. Ukrainian officials say that this peace deal itself is a weapon that Moscow is using to try to destroy their country. What is your assessment?
Well, if you take the Russian interpretation of it, absolutely, then the Russians are trying to use the Minsk agreement to that particular effect. That is not going to be accepted by Kiev, obviously. It is an agreement that isn't entirely clear. There's some rather dubious element of it. And there has been a significant disagreement between Moscow and Kiev on the timing of it, on local elections and special status and who's going to control the borders. So it is a very sort of, it was drafted with too much of a precision. That is used by Moscow very much in order to impose upon Ukraine a version of the Minsk agreement that is clearly detrimental to the security interests of the country. That's resisted by Kiev, understandably so.
I want to ask you last of all, Mr. Bildt, about the fact that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said he is hopeful that there can be good progress made, particularly this week, on finding a diplomatic solution to this crisis. As things stand at the moment, with these military drills taking place from the Russian side today, the response from Ukraine, are you confident that there is still an avenue for a diplomatic solution?
Well, I would agree with the Chancellor that one should be hopeful, but one should also be realistic. I mean, it's good that sort of Berlin and Paris is now sort of accelerating efforts on Donbass, on the Minsk process. But we should understand that the Russian game at the moment is much bigger. Donbass is a sideshow, I have to say. The Russian game, if you listen to Mr. Putin and see the documents that they've put on the table, is about Ukraine as a whole and is about sort of changing the entire European security order. And that is a negotiation that they are undertaking primarily with the US and with NATO. That's the big game that we see at the moment.
We'll have to leave it there. Carl Bildt, the co-chair of the European Council of Foreign Relations, former Prime Minister of Sweden. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.